1 Kings 16. 1 Kings 16. Last week we talked about this faithful king named Asa. Asa was a wonderful king. He was faithful to the Lord all of his life. He reigned in Judah for 41 years. And we saw this correlation, this symbiotic relationship between Asa and God, where Asa relied on the Lord, and he trusted in the Lord, and he sought the Lord with all of his heart, and what God gave him back was peace and rest. And so these were warring times. People fought and killed one another. That was just part of the culture that they lived in. And in fact, there's a phrase in the springtime when kings would go to war. They would go to war every year. But during Asa's first 35 years of his 41-year reign, he only went to war one time because God gave him supernatural peace and rest, because Asa, instead of relying on alliances with other countries, he sought the Lord with all of his heart and relied on God. So it was a great story of faithfulness, and our big takeaway was, if you'll seek the Lord, what will he give you? Supernatural peace in your heart. And when you walk away from God, what's the first thing that's taken away? Peace. Your peace, right? Your peace. So while all that's going on in South Judah, and they are being prosperous, and they are being at peace, and living at peace, and things are going well, things aren't going very well in North Israel. In fact, during that 41 years, there were 5 kings in North Israel that lasted during that 41-year reign of Asa, that all lived and died and gone because there was turmoil in Israel the whole time because of their faithfulness. Because when you're unfaithful to God, what do you lose? Your peace. Well, with 3 years left, in the 38th year of Asa's reign, there was a famous king in North Israel that came to reign, and his name was Ahab. And Ahab took the throne in Israel and reigned for 22 years. 22 years. And so Ahab is one of those names most people have heard. Have you ever heard the name Ahab? And what other word is associated with Ahab? Ahab and? Arab. No, Jezebel. Jezebel, right? Ahab and Jezebel. So we're going to look at Ahab, and I'm going to start today by showing you at the top of your notes 3 things that made Ahab so well known. Okay? Number 1, Ahab was incredibly wicked. Incredibly wicked. In fact, the Bible tells us that up until this point in Israel's history, he was the most wicked king that ever sat on the throne. Now, unfortunately, before it's over, there's one more that's more wicked than Ahab. But Ahab gets a second place for the most wicked king in Israel's history, unfortunately. So I want to read to you verses 29 through 34, and this is going to be a story that will illustrate Ahab's wickedness. Ahab, the son of Omri, began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned in Samaria 22 years, but Ahab did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. So if you were wondering where I got my information, it's right there. That's where I got my information. And as though it were not enough to live like Jeroboam, he married Jezebel, the daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and he began to worship Baal. First he built a temple and an altar for Baal in Samaria. Then he set up the Asherah pole. He did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of the other kings of Israel before him. So he is a very wicked man. Now here's a story, an illustration of how wicked the country of Israel became under his leadership. It was during his reign that Hiel, a man from Bethel, rebuilt Jericho. When he laid the foundations, his oldest son Abiram died. And when he finally completed it by setting up the gates, his youngest son Segub died. This all happened according to the message from the Lord concerning Jericho, spoken by Joshua, the son of Nun. Let me tell you what that means. That means that this guy Hiel, when he went to rebuild the walls in the city of Jericho, went And he took his oldest son and sacrificed that son and put him under the foundation of the walls of the city. And then he took his youngest son and killed his youngest son and put his youngest son underneath the gates. It was a sacrifice to Baal and to the gods to ward off evil spirits and give good spirits to the city. So it was child sacrifice. And these kids, most scholars believe, were babies, 1 to 2 years old. So they took little babies, chopped them up into little pieces, and actually wove them into and made kind of a paste out of the mortar, and that child was put in the mortar that made the foundation and the gates of this city. Is that pretty wicked? That's pretty wicked. And so the story is an illustration of how famously wicked and ungodly the people were in Israel during the time of Ahab. Okay, so he's very famous for being a wicked, wicked man. Number 2, he's famous for marrying Jezebel. Jezebel was the daughter of a Sidonian king named Ethbaal, which means Baal exists. She was one of the meanest and most wicked women in history, and Ahab was famous for marrying her. In fact, when you read the story of Ahab, so many times it is Jezebel that is acting out and is the most wicked one, and Ahab just doesn't have the guts to stand up to her. And there's a story that we won't cover, but if you'll go back and reread the story of Ahab, there's a story in which there was a man that owned a vineyard, and Ahab wanted it and went to the man and said, "Hey, would you sell me your vineyard? I'll give you all these things." And the man said no, and he went home and was pouting, and Jezebel said, "What's wrong, Ahab?" And he says, "Well, I was talking to this guy down the road, and he won't sell me his vineyard." And she says, "Oh, I'll take care of it for you." She went, had the guy killed, and then gave Ahab the vineyard. So that's the kind of girl Jezebel was. She was a real sweetheart. So one of the meanest, most wicked women in history, and Ahab was famous for being married to her. Okay, number 3, Ahab is known as the antagonist in the Elijah story. In other words, when you look and read about Ahab, almost everything about Ahab is tied to Elijah. And he is the antagonist. Elijah is the hero. Elijah is the one standing up for truth. Elijah is the one protecting the nation of Israel. And Ahab is the antagonist who is always causing problems that Elijah is having to come and address. Okay, so Ahab is the antagonist in the Elijah story. The story is not about Ahab and Jezebel and how wicked they are. The story is the faithfulness of Elijah and the faithfulness of God to overcome the evil that was in Israel. Okay, and probably the most famous story out of the Ahab-Elijah conflict we're going to study today, and that comes out of chapter 18. So if you'll turn over to chapter 18 with me, verses 1 through 19 I'm not going to read, but I am going to give you the context, and it's right there in your notes. There was a severe drought in Israel which caused a famine. The drought was the judgment upon the Lord for the wickedness of Ahab and Jezebel, the people of Israel. Jezebel was devoted to killing off all the prophets of God. That was her mission. She was a daughter of a king that worshiped Baal. Her whole life was about Baal, and her honor to Baal was to kill all the prophets of God. Okay? So she goes on a mission, and she just rounds up. If you see a prophet of God, you bring him in. She killed him. And she killed hundreds of prophets of God because she was trying to eradicate Judaism in North Israel and have Baal the official religion of North Israel. Now, her chief of staff's name was Obadiah. And Obadiah secretly had 100 prophets of God hidden in caves so that she would not be successful and kill out all the prophets of God. And so he did that behind her back. Now, God comes to Elijah and says, "Elijah, I want you to set up a meeting with Ahab because I have something I want to tell Ahab." And so Elijah goes to Obadiah and says, "I want a meeting with Ahab." And Obadiah says, "No, I'm not going to let you have a meeting with Ahab because Ahab and Jezebel have promised that the day they see you, they're going to kill you. And so if you go before Ahab, he'll kill you, and I'm not going to let you do that. And Elijah said, here's the thing, God told me to do this, so it doesn't matter what you think. I am going to go before Ahab. And so Obadiah sets up this meeting. Elijah comes before Ahab, and he tells Ahab, you know, you are an idolater. God is very displeased with what you're doing as king, and God is going to come in judgment upon this land. That's why we have this drought. That's what's going on. You've got to repent. And of course, he was not met with great favor by Ahab and Jezebel. And so what Elijah does is he says, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a test between my God and your God up on the top of Mount Carmel. And that's where we're going to pick up the story now and begin to read about the challenge that Elijah issues to not only Ahab and Jezebel, he issues the challenge to all the people in Israel. So let's begin reading now in chapter 18, verse 20. Chapter 18, verse 20. So Ahab summoned all the people and the prophets to Mount Carmel. So who's on Mount Carmel? All the people of Israel, right? And all the prophets of Baal. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, how long are you going to waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. But the people were completely silent. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God. And all the people agreed. So Elijah issues this challenge. They're up there on this mountain. He says, okay, prophets of Baal, all 450 of you, and I think there were also 400 prophets of the Asherah, if I remember correctly. And they're all up there. He says, build a big altar out of stone, put the wood on top, take the bull, cut it up, prepare it for a sacrifice, and I'm going to do the same. And then here's what I want you to do. Call upon the name of your God. And if he's a real God, he will set the fire to the altar. And if my God's a real God, he'll set the fire to the altar. And the one who sets the altar on fire is the true God, and you will follow him. Who's in? And all the people said, amen. Let it begin. So, they do. Beginning in verse 25. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, you go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call on the name of your God. But do not set fire to the wood. So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of Baal all morning, shouting, O Baal, answer us. But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced wildly around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. You'll have to shout louder, he scoffed, for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or he is relieving himself. Or maybe he is away on a trip, or he is asleep and needs to be awakened. So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but still there was no reply, no voice, and no answer. They literally called out to Baal all day long. They started early in the morning. They cried out until noon. By the afternoon, they're cutting themselves, they're screaming, and Elijah is taunting them. Just taunting them. Where's your God? Where's the power in your God? And he absolutely taunted them from morning till evening, but nothing happened. Nothing happened to the sacrifice on their altar. Okay? So here's where we're going to stop, because I want to make a point here, because I believe the way that they acted is exactly the response that we get to false gods today. And if you'll notice down on the bottom of your first page, I call it futility. And reality is, the Christian God is Jehovah God, and in Him is all power and authority. And He gives meaning and purpose and fulfillment in life. And all things else, all other idols, all other religions are false and bring futility. They promise something. Satan always promises something, right? And it might provide some temporary comfort or relief or pleasure, but it never provides fulfillment in the long term. So I want to stop and get around the tables, and I want to talk about this. I've given you 3 or 4 questions here about false religions and idols that in our culture people are looking for answers to their life problems. And so I want you to talk about this issue, then we'll come back and talk about your answers, and then we'll move on with the story. Our culture is so much like the culture back then. People are hungry. They're looking for fulfillment. They're looking for peace. We were talking about this around this table. Everyone's looking for the same thing. They're looking for peace. Now, they'll disguise it as something else. They'll talk about happiness. They'll talk about this, that, or the other. But what they're looking for is peace. The Bible is very clear. You only find peace one place. Where is that? Relationship with God, right? Everything else will offer you false peace for a moment, but it never gives you true peace over the long haul. Okay? So, that's exactly what happened to these guys. Their religion had no power. And they looked at it, and I'm sure they had some control, but they didn't have any power. They didn't have the power of God in their lives. And I see this, and it's amazing to me how many false religions have grown up in America over the last 50 years. Buddhism is growing in America. Hinduism is growing in America. The Muslim religion is growing in America, especially in prisons. And there's a facade of godliness about it, but at the end of the day, there's no power, and there's no peace, and there's no fulfillment. We brought a guy to Christ 2 years ago on the Thursday group, and he came out of Buddhism. And I said, what made you transition over? What made you come attend a group in the first place? And he says, it's interesting, Buddhism is a religion of peace. That's what they claim. But I went through a divorce with my wife, and I couldn't find peace. And so I was looking for peace because I was hurting so bad because my wife left me, and Buddhism offered me nothing. When I came to Embark and I found Christ, I immediately found peace. Now, he didn't get his wife back. It was too late. But he found peace, and in it, he found a relationship with God, and now his life is completely changed and doing different. Why did he choose Christianity over Buddhism? Because at the end of the day, Buddhism offers nothing. It offers some platitudes, but it offers nothing that changes the heart. And it's the same way with every false religion. And then what are the things that we look for as men that are also idols to find fulfillment? It's usually either women or money, right? Well, guess what women and money will get you? About the same thing Buddhism will. Not much peace. Okay? Yeah, Rick.
Being a Mormon, I went through that exact same thing. And I went to the bishop at the time. We were struggling, and I asked him, can you help us? What can you do? And there was nothing that he could do. There was nothing, he didn't have any answers to anything. And I said, well, then all these things that you're teaching us, okay, isn't real. Because he couldn't, that was the fundamentals, was family and all of these things. Well, when it came down to the tough question, he didn't even answer. What he really did is they alienated, because since we were going to go through divorce, he alienated me because I was looking for answers.
Yep. But think about it. Even if you're looking for marriage for your place of fulfillment in life, and you're pro-family, but you don't have God that teaches you about dying to self, And so you're walking into your family to make you happy and fulfill you as a man. Is that going to work? I mean, even something good like family doesn't bring you what you're looking for. What brings you what you're looking for is Jesus Christ, who gives you the capacity then to die to self and go in, and then the family system does operate the way it's supposed to operate, right? One of the big problems in America with marriage is that we're looking for our spouse to fill the deepest need in our soul instead of Jesus Christ. And let me tell you something that your wife will never fulfill in your life, and that is the deepest needs in your soul. She's not created by God to meet your needs and make you happy, right? She's your helpmeet to walk through life with. She's your partner. She's your companion. But that's not her job to make you happy. That all comes from what? Dying to self in a relationship with God and God transforming your heart. That's where you find peace and contentment, joy, et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense to you? But boy, are we living in a culture that is frantically looking for peace in all the wrong places, right? That's what these guys were doing. Does that make sense? Okay, let's move on. Got to get to the end of the story. So, verse 30. Let me find verse 30. Then Elijah called to the people, "Come over here." They all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the Lord's altar because the prophets of Baal had torn the altar down, right? So he rebuilds the altar to the Lord. Then he dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons of water. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wool. Then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour the water over the offering and the wood." After they had done this, he said, "Do the same thing again." And when they were finished, he said, "Do it a 3rd time." So as they did this, and the water ran around the altar and even overflowed the trench. And the trench was big enough for 3 gallons. They poured gallons and gallons of water in here. So by the time they got done, the whole thing was just flooded, completely drenched in water. Okay? At the customary time for the offering, the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God and that you have brought them back to yourself." The false prophets had futility. Elijah had faith. And his faith was born out of years of walking with God. Years of trusting God in the small things. And as he trusted God in the small things, he was able to learn to trust the God in the big things. So that by the time the most single important event of his life is before him, he can stand in faith because he knows in the past God took care of things. He knows this time God's going to take care of it too. Imagine the faith that it took to stand on that mountain in front of all of those false prophets and all of the people and to douse that altar with water because you absolutely know that your God's going to come through and provide fire for that altar. Where did he learn that? He learned it in those alone time with God. He learned it in the small details of life. He learned it just walking day to day, trusting in God for his sustenance. Go read chapter 17. It'll be a story that will show you where a lot of his faith came from. But it came from the little things. How do we get faith today for the big things, guys? Through trusting him in the little things, right? And as we trust him in the little things, we'll learn to trust him in the big things. But I want to tell you something, and I'm saying this as a warning. If you're not willing to let go and trust him in the little things, when the big things come, you'll fail the test. You will, because you don't have anything to fall back on, because you never trusted him in the little things. So when it comes time for the big one, you'll cower in fear because you're not sure he'll really come through. You know when faith is at its greatest? When you're hung out over the edge and if God doesn't show up, you're done. That's when faith is the greatest. Right? Mike, you ever been there? Yeah, a couple times, huh? Yeah, you guys been there before?
Still got the sin.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about faith for just a couple of minutes around your groups again, and of course on the video, and then we'll come back and we'll wrap up the story. Out of this story that is a biblical principle that we really need to understand as we walk through life. So let's finish this up. Beginning in verse 38, immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the ditch. And when the people saw it, they fell on their faces and cried out, "The Lord is God! The Lord is God!" Then Elijah commanded, "Seize all the prophets of Baal, don't let a single one escape." So the people seized them all, and Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley and killed them there. Now, I really don't want to talk a whole lot about, in the name of the Lord, why you want to kill 450 false prophets. We'll leave that for another theological discussion. Here's what I want you to know, though. That was that nation, that was that time, and that's how you dealt with issues, correct? What you see is an unbelievable act of power of God, where this thing is drenched in water, and the fire of God comes down and literally just wipes out the whole thing. And the people see, and they go, "Wow, we saw the prophets of Baal beg all day and got nothing. All Elijah had to do was say a 1-minute prayer, and God just absolutely came and burned up the altar." We want to follow God. We want to follow God. Here's the point I want to make. People want to follow people of faith. They want to follow people of faith. But there is a correlation in Scripture between God's faithfulness, His acting in power, so that His name is made famous to the masses, and our willingness to put our reputation on the line for Him to act. Let me put it this way. If Elijah had never had the faith to build the altar, God would have never sent the fire. He had to put his neck out on the line, didn't he? And say, you know what, I believe God's going to send a fire, and so I'm going to go ahead and build the altar in front of all these false prophets, in front of all these people. One of my favorite Old Testament stories is when the Israelites are about to cross over into Israel to take the land. And it's springtime, and it's said that the Jordan River was at flood stages. In other words, it was a mighty rushing river, and anyone would have tried to cross it would have been killed. And so God said, here's what we're going to do. You're going to cross the river, and I'm going to bring you across on dry ground. So, I want you to get the Ark of the Covenant. I want you to put it in the hands of the priests that have the poles, and I want you guys to start marching, and I want you to march into the water. And when your ankles get in the water, then I will part the river, and you will cross on dry ground. And He didn't come in power until in faith they stepped in the water. They built the altar. They would have never seen the power of God if they hadn't been willing to step in the water, step of faith. Elijah would have never seen the fire come down from heaven and change the whole country of North Israel if he hadn't been willing to build the altar. And here's what happens too many times with us Christians. We stand on the edge of the water and we say, okay, God, I believe in your power. I believe in your power. And God says, okay, then step out in the water and let me show you the power. No, God, you show me your power first. And I want you to know that God's power follows our step of obedience. It follows our step of faith. And if we're not ever willing to put our neck on the line and step out in faith, we're probably not going to see the miraculous power of God in our lives. And so, yes, it's like a game of chicken. And God says, you're going to take the first step. I'm ready. I'm here. I'm going to perform a miracle in your life. I'm going to do something powerful, and you're going to see the glory of God displayed. But are you willing to take the step of faith? And as long as we're standing on the shore where it's nice and safe, we're not going to see the waters part. And we're not going to see the fire come from heaven and burn up the altar. We're going to sit in a nice, safe spot with a nice, safe God and a nice, safe religion and make no difference in the world. And so we got to make the decision. Elijah was a man of faith. That's why the story ended the way it did. Now, God could have said, Elijah, you're not the one. I'll go get another man that's willing to build the altar. And so it's not that God loses out and is unwilling to work. It's just that God's going to work through somebody else if it's not through me. And who does he want to work through? All of us. But he's only going to work those who are willing to step out in obedience and faith. So I think that's the real powerful story for today. That's the powerful story. We're just about out of time, but we have 2 or 3 minutes. Right there at the end, there's a couple of questions about faith and takeaways. Why don't you go around and talk about those, and then the day is yours. Thanks for being here, guys. I hope it fed you this morning.